Welcome to all the chairpersons. First talk by Dr. Madhusudan Upadhyay. Over to Dr. Madhusudan Upadhyay.
Good morning, everybody. Whoever is associated with labor analgesia and obstetric anesthesia practice will have to encounter a wet tap and subsequently the PDPH sometime in their practicing life. Therefore, it's imperative that we all know how to manage the wet tap and the PDPH, which may occur after the wet tap. And since it is very disconcerting for the mother and the family involved, I think it's imperative that we manage the PDPH effectively and maybe prophylactically too. And over the next 18-20 minutes, let's see how to manage wet tap and the PDPH. And before that, let me take you through the history and a little bit of pathophysiology to understand why the PDPH happens. And I will try to get you the evidence for the management of PDPH. As per Sir August Bayer, PDPH, he explained the PDPH thus: I had a feeling of very strong pressure on my skull and became rather dizzy when I stood up rapidly from my chair. All these symptoms vanished at once when I lay down flat, but returned when I stood up. The classic symptoms of PDPH, which any of your patients would describe to you as. And Sir August Bayer said, I was forced to take to bed and remained there for 9 days because all the manifestations recurred as soon as I got up. The symptoms finally resolved 9 days after the lumbar puncture. Mind you, those days, the lumbar puncture needles used to be of humongous size, and it used to be around 18 to 20 gauge compared to what we use nowadays, 25 to 26 to 27 gauge for any routine spinal anesthetic. Therefore, obviously, the incidence of PDPH those days should be much higher than what we encounter nowadays. I will just briefly take you through a case which we had recently. A 28-year-old female, primigravida, came for cesarean section due to breech presentation. And since she was on the plumper side, the BMI was about 28. And since it was a postgraduate who was doing the spinal anesthetic, we decided to go in with the 25 gauge needle. And routine spinal anesthetic was given. And the intraoperatively, there was nothing, absolutely, it was uneventful. However, 2 days later, she had complaints of headache. And the headache, as she described, was acute, episodic, bilateral, and frontal throbbing associated with vomiting. It was not radiating, not associated with facial pain or twitching. When you look at the severity of it, as per the modified Liebecker classification, it is moderately severe, moderate. The symptoms were relieved on lying supine and aggravated on sitting or standing positions. She had no history of blurring of vision, tinnitus, neck rigidity, fever, or convulsions, and there was no history of similar episodes in the past. Hence, we diagnosed PDPH in the young lady. How do you define PDPH? It is a headache occurring within 5 days of a lumbar puncture caused by CSF leakage through the dural puncture. It's usually accompanied by neck stiffness and/or subjective hearing symptoms. Remember, it gets into remission spontaneously within 2 weeks or after sealing of the leak with autologous epidural blood patch. And it has to fit into the ICHD-3 classification of 7.2.1, the headache attributed to low CSF pressure. 7.2.1 is post-dural puncture headache. And how do you come to this diagnosis? The headache fulfilling the criteria for 7.2 should be, there should have been a dural puncture performed, and the headache has developed within 5 days of the dural puncture and not better accounted for by another ICHD-3 diagnosis. there you have the diagnosis of post-dural puncture headache. The pathophysiology, simply put, is not well described, but still, please remember that the CSF pressure, which is about 5 to 15 centimeters of water, therefore the patient will have the dragging headache. The CSF leak leads to reduced CSF volume and pressure, the sagging of brain and stretch of the neural fibers and resultant headache. Please remember that cerebral vasodilation is also a part of the pathophysiology. Therefore, you have to remember when you treat the PDPH, you have to look at the drugs which cause cerebral vasoconstriction. The incidence, we don't have many studies looking at the incidence of PDPH in Indian population, but this study published in the Indian Journal of Anesthesia in the year 2018, in the intentional dural puncture group, the PDPH was seen in 16 patients with an incidence of 3.9%, while there was a 25% incidence of PDPH in wet tap group. The incidence of PDPH after wet tap in parturient patients was around 50 to 86%. Therefore, if you have either an intentional or accidental dural puncture in a pregnant woman, the incidence could be 100%, which 86% is very close to being every patient suffering from the PDPH. Why should you be worried about the PDPH? Because the complications could be subdural hematoma, seizures, cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 can end up with palsies, nausea and dizziness. There could be acute and chronic headaches and acute and chronic backache. Therefore, we look at the management of this, try to get you the evidence for each one of this, because there is no gold standard for the management of post-dural puncture headache. But there have been a lot of methods postulated, and I will try to take up each one of them and try to give you the evidence whether it's useful or not, or used or not. Hydration and the bed rest is something which we always advocate, but there is no evidence that vigorous hydration has any therapeutic benefit. According to this Cochrane's review in the year 2016, but however, no patient with PDPH should be allowed to become dehydrated. That is not a response to the no evidence for the hydration. Therefore, the patient should be hydrated well, though not overhydration. And coming to the bed rest, it probably increases the chances of having PDPH. Therefore, no nursing mother is allowed to lie down just like that to avoid the PDPH, but rather they're requested to walk around so that since it does not have any effect on the PDPH. These practices should no longer be routinely recommended since there is no evidence supporting them. Again, from the same systematic review, Cochrane systematic review. What about the overhydration? It can be counterproductive because theoretically, overhydration means that there is increased ANP production from the cardiac muscles. And once there is an increased ANP production, there could be decreased CSF production. Therefore, the patient, if she is leaking from the rent we have created in the subarachnoid, into the subarachnoid space, can have more CSF, drying of CSF, and can have more symptoms. The caffeine, we always thought, is the panacea for the headache following PDPH. So too the methylxanthines. Caffeine basically is a CNS stimulant, and it reversibly blocks cerebral adenosine receptors. The vasoconstriction of dilated cerebral blood vessels is the result, and therefore caffeine has been advocated all the while. And we have always advised the patients to have a lot of coffees, and you can also give them oral or intravenous caffeine once or twice daily. Single oral dose for mild PDPH was proved to be safe, and caffeine sodium benzoate as an IV bolus or infusion was proved to be 75 to 80% effective. But please remember that the caffeine gives only transient improvement. Therefore, you cannot be using it for the permanent treatment. Cosintropin, which is the synthetic ACTH, it stimulates the adrenals to increase the CSF production and beta endorphin output, and it also leads to volume expansion and electrolyte retention. The dose is given at 60 units intramuscular or 1 to 1.5 units per kg intravenous. Pain relief at days 3 to 7, and it's quite effective. But caution in patients with type 2 diabetes and hypertension, because it increases the blood glucose levels and fluid and electrolyte retention. Both are not good for hypertensives and diabetics. Therefore, use it with caution in those patients. Hydrocortisone has been tried, and an intravenous dose of 200 milligrams and then 100 milligrams 3 times a day for 48 hours. And it decreases the VAS score by about 50% 6 hours later and 75% 24 hours after treatment. But hydrocort or any steroid has a lot of side effects like sodium retention related weight gain, fluid accumulation, hyperglycemia, hypokalemia, and the mood changes. And maybe it has to be again used with caution in patients with PDPH in the post-operative period. The sumatriptan has been used occasionally. It causes the vasoconstriction of intracranial vessels, and it has to be used subcutaneously, 6 milligrams every dose. Few case reports have been reported, and improvement of symptoms while clinical trials have proved inefficacy. Therefore, we as such don't have enough data to say that sumatriptan can be used and it is efficacious. Side effects, the chest tightness is something which can be very harmful to the patient and it might mislead. Therefore, don't use it in the patients with ischemic heart disease, because the vasoconstriction of the cardiac vessels may not be advisable to the patient. Gabapentin has been used, and it is likely to increase the concentration of GABA in the brain and be beneficial to the patients. Orally, you use about 900 milligrams every 8 hourly for about 4 days, and it decreases the VAS score for 5 days. And unfortunately, 12% of the methanol level is secreted in the breast milk. Therefore, the nursing mother cannot be using gabapentin for the relief of headache with PDPH. Ergot alkaloids have been used. It may hasten the resolution of PDPH, and it's only a small uncontrolled pilot study has been available to us, and 0.25 milligrams orally 3 times a day for a day to 2 days, and it may hasten resolution of PDPH, but the evidence is quite weak. Spinopalatine or pterygopalatine ganglion block is useful. There has been a paper in the Indian Journal of Anesthesia also recently on spinopalatine ganglion block, and transnasal, it can be accessed through so many routes, but transnasally is one of the easiest approaches, and the block may relieve the patient of pain following PDPH. Occipital nerve block also has been tried, the bilateral occipital nerve block. There is a winding down of central sensitization due to interruption of efferent input to the dorsal horn and TNC neurons temporarily. This relieves the headache due to PDPH as well as those due to the other chronic pain syndromes. It's a tedious block to perform, but has been advised to take care of the severe PDPH pain. And now the last one is epidural blood patch. It's touted to be the definitive therapy for PDPH, and all the other modalities are symptomatic, but this one may give you permanent relief from the CSF leak and thereby the headache associated with the PDPH. But it may reduce the long-term complications and serious side effects too. But it also has its own negativities, and let's not go into the details of that. But do you have any other options other than blood? Can you push saline or colloid into the epidural space? Mannitol can be pushed. Fibrin glue, intrathecal catheters, and epidural morphines all have been tried, and to varied results, and we'll see one by one. Saline and colloids, obviously when you push saline or colloid into the epidural space, it increases the pressure in the epidural space, therefore it prevents the leak of CSF from the subarachnoid space. But mostly, since it is saline or colloid which gets redistributed in the epidural space rapidly, the reduction in the headache is only temporary, and the headache will come back with at least 50% of the patients will have recurrence of the headache. Colloids obviously are better than the saline into the epidural space because colloids stay there for a little longer time. Elder et al. Were the first to show that injection of about 3.5 to 4.5 milligrams of morphine via an epidural catheter caused total relief of the pain in about 6 patients. And then Al-McVelly et al., they came up with another study wherein they injected 3 milligrams of morphine epidurally, and they also concluded that it significantly reduces the PDPH, and the need for the epidural blood patch comes down. But epidural morphine will also have its own side effects, and you have to consider them too. Fibrin glue is another possibility. The fibrin glue actually consists of 2 biological components, including thrombin solution and fibrinogen, and it creates a 3-dimensional gel within seconds. Therefore, before you think of epidural blood patch, you can be injecting fibrin glue into the epidural space. But there is not enough evidence to support the use of fibrin glue because of the side effects. It has risk for infections and then immune reactions, and fibrin glue can also cause anaphylaxis. Intrathecal catheter has been a relatively newer practice where you push in a catheter through the dural rent, and the inflammation, the mechanism of action is believed to be a local inflammation created by the catheter that promotes dural tear healing and reduces the CSF leak. And the inflammation, once you remove the epidural catheter from the subarachnoid space in 24 hours time, the inflammation which has already set in will close the rent. Therefore, the dictum is you have to leave the epidural catheter for a period of 24 hours intrathecally. How did we manage our case? After initial counseling and reassurance, she was advised complete bed rest and hydration with fluids. Are we justified? Maybe at that time, yes. She was started on tablet caffeine citrate 300 milligrams BD and was advised tablet paracetamol 500 milligrams SOS. She had kind of a relief, and she didn't have any more symptoms during her hospital stay. She was discharged on the post-op day 7. That is basically because she had the complaints of headache. We wanted to follow her up in the hospital. But however, on arriving home, she developed similar complaints. And we advised her to continue with the caffeine and paracetamol. And if the headache persisted, she was advised to come to the hospital for further management. She never followed up. And on a telephonic follow-up, we came to know that she had been totally relieved of the headache. The PDPH of the milder variety didn't trouble us much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Madhusudan Upadhyay. Next, we have Dr. Sunil Pandya. Over to Dr. Sunil Pandya.
Good morning, all. It is my privilege to be a part of ISACON Kerala web conference, and I thank all the organizing committee members for giving me this privilege to share my experience on this topic of abnormal placentation and emergency cesarean section or elective cesarean section. So next 20 minutes or so, I shall be talking on this topic and share my experience. Greetings from Hyderabad, greetings from Prerna team, greetings from Fernandez Hospital. As you know, we were the first to start a dedicated obstetrical care unit way back in 1998. And we also run a level 4 critical care unit at Century Hospital with all the facilities, advanced life supports that 10% of the patients may need, like ECMO, IABP, interventional radiology, so on and so forth. Need conflict of interest. The photograph that I have displayed in my presentation have been obtained with patient's consent. And if anybody is using this presentation, please delete those photographs, not to put in the social media. If you look at the maternal mortality in our country, as per the WHO, this is a old data, 2014, hemorrhage was a leading cause of maternal death in our country, followed by sepsis, followed by preeclampsia. But of late, in 2019, preeclampsia has taken over hemorrhage and sepsis. So preeclampsia is a leading cause of maternal death, but hemorrhage also is a very important cause of maternal mortality. Importantly, we need to know that it occurs in otherwise healthy individuals. Coming to the topic, morbidly adherent placenta. Well, abnormal placentation can be categorized into placenta accreta, where the superficial layer of uterine endometrium is adherent; placenta increta, where the placenta encroaches upon the myometrium and it is difficult to separate; and placenta percreta, where the placenta encroaches upon the uterine endometrium, myometrium, and it goes beyond the uterus serosa and can impinge on the adjacent organs like bladder commonly, or go into the broad ligament, or go posteriorly into the colon or the sigmoids. The crux of managing adherent placenta is timely diagnosis, a multidisciplinary planning. Lack of defined protocol and checklist are the major cause of mortality that we see with morbidly adherent placenta. Well, if we don't plan properly, we see a bloodshed in theater, and this scenario is very common, especially if you don't plan your surgeries in parturients with adherent placenta, and we need to have a meticulous planning. Well, if you look at the data from ICU of our at Fernandez Hospital, this is again an old slide of 2014. Hemorrhage is the leading cause of a second leading cause of ICU admission. Almost about 12% of cases at Fernandez Hospital. And one of the commonest cause of hemorrhage again is adherent placenta. On an average, we do about 30 cases of peripartum hysterectomy because of either adherent placenta or returning PPH, which is a very, very high incidence. If you look at the surgeries that are common surgeries that are performed in 1980s, 90s, the commonest surgery that was performed worldwide was tonsillectomy. Fortunately, with good antihistaminics and good ENT surgical approach and good antibiotics, most of those adenoidectomies, tonsillectomies are on the waning side. And from 2000 onwards, the most commonly performed surgical procedure worldwide is cesarean section, and hence the increased incidence of adherent placenta. So what are the current concepts when we discuss about adherent placenta? Well, first and foremost is we have to identify abnormal placentation, the management of blood and blood products and coagulation monitoring, the pharmacological management during massive hemorrhage, damage controlled resuscitation when the bleeding occurs. More importantly, one has to be abreast with massive transfusion protocol. And when you have a patient with obstetric hemorrhagic shock, how do you give safe anesthesia? And if at all the patient is stable, what are the other radiological interventions or endovascular interventions that are available in our armamentarium in managing adherent placenta? If you look at the incidence of adherent placenta, it is increasing dramatically, as I said, again, because of the increased rate of cesarean sections worldwide. At Fernandez Hospital, it is 1 in 600 pregnancies. ACOG, the American Society of Gynecologists, is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000 deliveries. It's a very big range. And if you look at the incidence of different types of adherent placenta, Eccritas constitute about 75 to 78%, Incretas 15 to 18%. Fortunately, placenta percutta is 5 to 7% only. But these are the nightmares for the obstetrician, for the anesthesiologist, and for the entire team. So I shall be discussing on the following outlines. What are the identification markers for abnormal placentation and management of blood and blood component therapy, damage control resuscitation, and endovascular or radiological intervention. More importantly, the diagnostic modalities is arise risk factors. If you have a gland multiparity, in fact, I always insist my fellows to look at PSC to look at the ultrasound report also and look at the position of placenta. Generally, most of the placenta either is posteriorly upper segment or anteriorly upper segment. But if at all placenta is in the upper lower segment posteriorly or lower segment anteriorly, then you need to have a high index of suspicion. Placenta previa, even in a primary gravida, unless and until otherwise, should always be considered as adherent placenta. And if placenta previa occurs in a parturient with previous cesarean section, unless until proved otherwise, should always be considered as adherent placenta only. And fortunately, it can be diagnosed easily on ultrasound, but MRI is a diagnostic tool, but it can tell us the adherent, like Eccrita, Increta, and Percutta can safely be differentiated on an MRI. And I have included cystoscopy also because the Percuttas, they commonly invade anteriorly and can encroach into the bladder, and a bleeding from the bladder is hell. Believe me, it is really hell, and it's very, very difficult to control, especially if bladder is involved. So, as I said, placenta previa and a previously scarred uterus could be myomectomy scar, it could be DNC done in the past. It should be considered as abnormal placenta only. So the risk factors for adherent placenta or abnormal placentation are placenta previa, previous cesarean section, that is more the number of sections, the higher the incidence. Any uterine anomalies like Didelphys uterus or previous myomectomy scars, any history of myomectomy or advanced maternal age and grand multi or multiparity. Well, clinically, the laboratory investigations that can guide us to say it is abnormal placentation is elevated alpha-fetoprotein, elevated human gonadotropin, but the sensitivity and specificity of these markers are really low, and we don't generally advocate or monitor. On ultrasound, how do we diagnose? Basically, this is the forte of obstetrician in the fetal medicine department. But if we have to look at, we just have to look for marked thinning of or the loss of retroplacental hypoechoic zone, or interruption of hyperechoic border between the uterine serosa and the bladder, visualization of prominent vessels or lakes within the placenta or the myometrium. This is a very, very important sign. Lakes within the placenta and myometrium. These are very, very easily seen even by a naive anesthesiologist. And visualization of lacunae has the highest sensitivity, allowing identification in 78 to 93% of cases after 15 weeks of gestation, with almost 79% of specificity. And this is what I say, moth-eaten appearance of placenta is very, very common. And if you do a Doppler, you see placental lakes of high vascularity. And this is a typical angry-looking ultrasound, typical high vascularity, and you need to have these patients have institutional delivery with a backup of a surgical oncologist, a urologist, and a multidisciplinary team. This is a case that should not be managed in a nursing home. Ultrasound, if you look at the sensitivity, is about almost 90%, and generally the positive predictive value is 68%, but the negative predictive value is 98%. So it's a very, very important diagnostic tool available in most of the hospitals, almost all the hospitals, all the obstetric centers, they have ultrasound. But the limitation is, if adherent placenta occurs on the lateral or the posterior walls of the uterus, it may be difficult to detect on an ultrasound. Hence, MRI becomes a diagnostic tool in this condition. It is a very accurate tool, and generally the HAST or the FISP sequences to minimize fetal and the metal motion artifacts are used in MRI, and demonstration of T2 bulging or loss of normal uterine contour is a diagnostic criteria. And if you look at the T2 weighted images on an MRI, assess the focal thinning of myometrium interruption of junctional zone, which indicates the adherence of placenta. So MRI imaging findings in typically adherent placenta are placenta previa, uterine bulging, heterogeneous signal intensity within the placenta, dark intraplacental bands on T2 weighted images, focal interruptions in myometrial wall, again very important diagnostic tool, and tenting of the bladder. Again, this includes percutaneous and invasion of bladder, and you need to have a urologist as a standby, or probably he should scrub along with the surgeon obstetrician. And direct visualization of invasion of pelvic structure by placental tissue. And this is what I meant, that thinning of the myometrium and the MRI findings which you see clearly. Cystoscopy, we have introduced this concept of doing cystoscopy in adherent placenta after burning our fingers very badly, where we took it for granted that it was turned out to be percutaneous with invaded bladder. And generally the symptoms are any parturient who has increased frequency or burning sensation or hematuria, which is a late symptom. But all these symptoms can spuriously be present even in normal pregnancy, especially if it's a retroverted gravid uterus. This is just a video showing bladder invasion. I think it is not playing, but this was a beautiful video that we had in the recent past, where the placental had invaded bladder, and we could see large tortuous blood vessel invading the bladder mucosa. So when we get a patient with adherent placenta at PSC, how do we approach? First and foremost, it has to be joint counseling. The couple and the family members have to be involved, because it is a very, very morbid surgery, and it should not be a hurried PSC before surgery. It has to be elective PSC unless the patient comes in an emergency unbooked case. But we need to explain the following facts to the patient, that we have now a protocolized approach almost for last 15 years that we follow. Re-educate the family about adherent placenta and see that we obtain consensus from obstetrician, so that we are on the same platform, we are on the same page, we talk the same language as obstetrician talks. We also have to explain with the family about the blood and blood components, massive transfusion, and massive needs of blood and blood products. And peripartum hysterectomy, because many a times, or probably I would say few occasions, where we had primary with adherent placenta, and if you give them option of peripartum hysterectomy, they'll be in a state of shock. So you need to discuss about the risk versus benefit of retaining placenta in a primary gravid or peripartum hysterectomy. All these things have to be electively discussed, and proper consent to be obtained. Importantly, also discuss about ICU admission following surgery, requirement of organ supports, and if the patient, despite peripartum hysterectomy, bleeds, or before hysterectomy, electively insertion of internal occlusion balloon catheters. I'll be discussing a little while later. But it is very prudent on our part that you should palpate both the dorsalis puellis. It is very important, because whenever they put balloons to the femoral artery, there might be sometimes thrombosis, and we need to have a baseline palpable pulse and document it clearly. Well, in our center, regional anesthesia is a preferred modality despite high bleeding chances, because we always feel that maternal bonding has to happen, and that gives a lot of confidence and positivity for the parturient. And we have to also be prepared the patient that in case if the patient bleeds massively, we may have to convert to general anesthesia. And generally what we do is, suppose if this parturient is a case of difficult airway, we straight away go for general anesthesia. There is no role of regional anesthesia in these cases, unless you want to give a combined general epidural, which we don't see much sense. So regional anesthesia is preferred if airway is fine. If the patient has difficult airway, we generally go for general anesthesia directly, because when the patient is bleeding, you don't have to struggle in securing an airway. You'll be wasting time, because every minute the mother will lose about a liter of blood, and it is very, very important for you to understand this point. All cases we insert central line, arterial line, and of course to be inserted before you induce the patient. The options we have to discuss again at PAC is, in addition to peripartum hysterectomies, generally we don't do subtotal hysterectomy in our center because sometimes the stump can bleed massively. We do total hysterectomy, which is a safer option. And we need to discuss, sometimes some of them wants to retain, suppose if it's a focal placenta, accreta or increta, retaining the placenta versus removing the uterus, options have to be discussed, and we need to honor the consent from the patient if they are educated. Generally in our center, we insert prophylactic intra-aortic balloon occlusion catheter in the internal iliac or common iliacs to minimize blood loss during peripartum hysterectomy. And we also have backup vascular clamps in case if there's a torrential hemorrhage. We can put clamps, vascular clamps on the common femoral artery, or few cases we have put on the aorta also because the situation was beyond control, and the manual compression of aorta also sometimes does not help. Devascularization procedures like internal iliac ligation or uterine artery, ovarian artery ligation also can be done as a part of procedure of controlling hemorrhage. So the problem with retaining placenta and is very tricky. We have had, at least I remember, 5 cases where we had retained the placenta, and subsequently, despite they developed pyometra, and generally a couple of cases we had given methotrexate also for the placenta to lyse. Currently there is no role of methotrexate, and this patient with pyometra, they had interval massive hemorrhage and they came with neutropenic sepsis. So all this pro and con have to be discussed with the patient, and yes, we have to be careful. So when you are retaining placenta, you have to monitor for sepsis. They may need prolonged antibiotics, frequent hospitalization, and despite all these things, they may still end up with hysterectomy. Serial beta HCG monitoring is a good way to assess the shrinking of placenta, and placental volume assessment on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, or subsequently, initially almost every alternate days done bi-weekly, and subsequently we can do weekly basis to know that placenta is shrinking. But as I said, 70% of parturients who opt for retaining placenta with focal or little more than focal placenta per incretas, they end up with emergency peripartum hysterectomy because of massive hemorrhage. As I said, in our center, almost about 70% of the cases we try to place balloon in the internal iliac. It works very well. It works very well. Manual compression of aorta also is a maneuver that can be opted upon, but again, it all depends on applying correct pressure, and you may hinder the surgeon surgical dissection. But yes, that is an option if you don't have intravascular clamps in your center. But as I said, we need to explain the risk of femoral iliac vessel thrombosis. In our center, we have seen thrombosis of 5 to 7%, and it's a very simple thing like massive transfusion, massive hemorrhage versus 5 to 7% risk of vascular thrombosis. The risk versus benefit, we have noted that this fresh thrombus which is there, it can easily be extracted with the Fogarty catheter, and patient you can avoid minimize massive transfusion. So the massive transfusion protocol that we follow in our hospital is we reserve and cross-match 6 Praxel, 6 FFPs, and 6 random donor platelets, and a donor for single donor platelet or apheresis platelet concentrate also is kept ready. We do a baseline CBC because we need to know the fresh hemoglobin coagulation profile on the day of surgery. We do fibrinogen because reducing level of fibrinogen postpartum or a peripartum indicates again massive transfusion. We need to calculate maximal allowable blood loss. As I said, we need to have a multidisciplinary team approach for managing. Well, this is a case, this is a little older case we had in 2017. And if you see, this was a morbidly adherent placenta with invasion of bladder and invasion of cervix for cesarean hysterectomy. She had severe anemia because of intermittent blood loss. Hemoglobin had fallen to 6 grams. She was on iron supplements. She had previous cesarean sections, no other comorbidities. And if you see, we had like dorsalis pedis felt that this is what we do, and more importantly, informed consent, sending the investigation that I just discussed, reservation of blood and blood components, and anti-acid aspiration prophylaxis, and the plan of management. Generally, we put peripheral vein 14 gauge, 16 gauge, central line, and arterial line. Generally, a triple lumen catheter we place. Epidural is the procedure of choice in our hospital. A single a capital catheter, not we don't give CAC because and we place epidural catheter at around 6 a.m. About 4 to 5 hours before, because when you are putting internal iliac occlusion balloon catheters, they use heparin, and we don't want any sort of bloody taps and heparin administered within a short time. Neither we want to put because once you put the balloon catheters, you can't flex the hips to obtain position for epidural. So we put epidural electively previous day or about 4 to 5 hours before procedure. And balloons are placed around 7:30, 8 o'clock, and we do a classical cesarean section. We don't go through the invaded layer. We just go do a classical section. So all these things are important. Planning and preparedness for major obstetric hemorrhage is very important. So the warmers are kept ready. The infusers with noradrenaline and other vasopressors are kept ready. But more importantly, warming hypothermia prevention is of mandatory requirement. Now, calculation of maximal allowable blood loss is mandatory so that we can know the transfusion triggers appropriately. As we know that the blood volume in a parturient is 90 ml per kg, unlike a non-pregnant patient, which is about 60 to 65 ml per kg. So you need to do a bedside calculation of maximal allowable blood loss by the formula which we all do. Generally the initial hematocrit and allowable hematocrit, and this is the form that we fill up for all cases. In fact, for all elective cesarean section, I mean, we fill up this MABL form. So the protocol in our hospital is we shift the patient to ICU 2 hours before surgery. Wide bore cannulas are placed. Epidural insertion is under local with epidural clamp. IJV arterial line placement. Foley's catheter should be placed again before you put occlusion balloon catheter, because again, I don't want the legs to be flexed for incision of Foley's because it can displace the balloon. And we give intravenous cafazolin as a surgical prophylaxis. Cystoscopy and ureteric stents are placed if there is a need. Otherwise, we don't do. We leave the choice to the obstetrician. We shift the patient to cath lab for balloon placement. Generally, there are some interventional radiologists who put balloons under CIAM guidance with minimal exposure, and there are some radiologists who are cardiologists who prefer balloon placement in the cath lab. Mutual discussion, heparin is administered before balloons are inserted, but as I said, try to minimize bloody taps during epidural catheter insertion. A senior person has to be involved. And both the sheaths and occlusion balloon catheters, we hep saline flush continuously or intermittently throughout to prevent any damage. So this is how the balloons are placed to the right femoral artery, the left femoral artery into the internal iliac, and we check the placement again before the patient is before the skin incision, so that we reconfirm the balloon catheter placement. So once the balloons are placed, bolus heparin is given. Activation of epidural catheter is done in a graded manner, and all the monitors are connected. We give prophylactic intravenous tranexamic acid after liaising with radiologists because they already have given heparin. Warming mattresses are kept. Convection warmer is also connected. Fluid administration by fluid warmer. Hypothermia prevention is mandatory because if there is a massive hemorrhage and massive transfusion, hypothermia can induce coagulopathy, acidosis, and that's a deadly triad. Acute normovolemic hemodilution, generally we give about 2 liters of ringal lactate as a prophylaxis, and blood bank is on the alert. Dedicated office boys are there to deliver the blood. And as I said, this is the occlusion balloon catheters. They inflate it once the baby is delivered. So we do a classical cesarean section, and once the baby is delivered, the balloons are inflated to about 8 to 10 to 14 atmospheres, and to secure hemostasis or to occlude the blood supply to the uterus so that you can minimize blood loss. Generally, as I said, we don't go for fenestrial or transverse incision. We always prefer midline incision, a classical cesarean section. And post-delivery, the balloons are inflated up to 8 to 10 atmospheres. The atmospheric the inflation, it all depends on the caliber of the intrailiac vessel. Some vessels are large, some are small. So generally, we occlude almost about 80 to 90% of the lumen of intrailiac so that you can minimize the blood loss. It is very important that you keep flushing the sheaths and balloon intermittently so that you don't prevent formation of clot. There are some obstetricians who don't use balloon. They do classical cesarean section, but what they do is they do selective ligation of all the bleeders and the sinuses before they deliver the baby. That again is a approach, time-consuming approach, because the surgical incision to delivery time is almost an hour. We don't practice such thing, but there are some papers that, especially the PGI protocol, is they selectively ligate all the blood vessels between the bladder and the sinus and the anterior segment before they incise the uterus. That also is a protocol. But if you see, this is the field, surgical field after balloon occlusion. It's a dry field, dry surgical field, and this is what the beauty of occlusion balloon catheter is. And if you see the blood loss at the end of the surgery, hardly any MOPS, like the elective cesarean section. And if you see, the suction bottles are also empty. And these are the true pictures. These are not the pictures. These are the true pictures of a patient with Perclitas. And this is what the specimen is. And if you see, a total invasion of uterus into the bladder. Generally, these are the surgeries that take a little longer time, beyond 3 to sometimes 4 hours also. And we repeat antibiotic if the surgical duration is beyond 4 hours. And post-hysterectomy, the balloons are deflated. Surgical hemostasis is secured. Bladder integrity is checked. Generally, we inject methylene blue so that if at all there is inadvertent bladder injury, it can be diagnosed and can be closed. Drain placement and closure is done. It is very important to place the drain because sometimes the patient may bleed again. And generally, at the end of surgery, we remove the sheath and the occlusion balloon catheters. It's done in OT, and the lower limb pulses are confirmed. Generally, what we do is whenever we palpate the dorsalis pedis, we put a marker so that it is easy to palpate the site. And if the pulsations are not there, immediately we do ultrasound and Fogarty and extraction of thrombus. Elective ventilation hardly is needed. We extubate the patient on table because most of the patients, they don't bleed, especially with balloon occlusion catheters. Post-operative pain management is patient-controlled epidural analgesia, antibiotics, and we are very particular that despite a morbid surgery like peripartum hysterectomy, and despite sometimes massive transfusion also, ERAS is universally followed in our hospital. Palpation lower limb pulses is mandatory, and it should be done at least for 40 to 72 hours. We put all patients on low microwave heparin, and prevention of postoperative pulmonary complication, especially if the patient requires massive transfusion, because massive transfusion, we all know that it can induce trially because of leukocytic reaction and sometimes can cause atelectasis and pulmonary complications. And generally, most of the patients, we transfer them to ward on the first post-op day. If you see, this is the patient sitting on the chair after a few hours after the surgery, and in the evening we made them ambulate, and we make them walk the next day, and they start feeding the baby also immediately. If lower limb pulses are feeble, immediate Doppler is done, and as I said, we explained them the risk of thrombosis. In our hospital, 5% risk of thrombosis is there, and immediately Fogarty aided thrombectomy can be done, and immediately you see the regained bounding pulsation. This is the freshly extracted thrombus from the femoral artery. So what we have done is, after a few cases, initial few cases of thrombosis, that also is a morbidity. And to overcome this morbidity of formation of thrombosis, we innovated a technique of continuous pressure saline irrigation of sheaths and balloon catheter. And after this intervention, this is our own innovation. We'll be publishing our data. And after this innovation, we have not seen any case of thrombosis. So basically what we do is, we contain 4 pressure bags with hep saline, minimal X, 1 to 2 units of heparin per ml, and continuously flush all both the sheaths and both the occlusion catheter so that the thrombus can be prevented. This is what the pressurized bags, which are continuously pressured, because sometimes intermittent flushing, there is a delay and the cath lab nurse may not be there. So this technique almost has virtually eliminated the risk of thrombosis that is associated with occlusion balloon catheters. Suppose if you have undiagnosed adherent placenta, what do you do? Like many times you unbook cases, when you get a patient like this, the moment you open up the uterus and you see abnormal placentation, call for, do not incise the uterus, call for expert help. Answer yourself, is my nursing home capable of handling this patient? Do I have blood in hand? Do I have access to the blood bank with the O negative or the patient in the specific group? If the answer is no, close the abdomen with a mop, sterile mop, cover the abdomen, transfer the patient to a hair center, and see that you give adequate surgical site prophylaxis. It's very, very important, because if you inside the uterus, you'll end up in problem. You may not get right help, you may not get proper help, and we may lose the patient. And I have seen patients who are referred to our center in a state of shock with hemoglobin not detected because they have burned their hands incising this uterus and they could not control the hemorrhage. So generally what we do is, as I said, wide bore peripheral cannulas, crystalloid resuscitation, pressors, arterial line, all these things are very, very important. As far as anesthesia is concerned, for some reason, if the patient has massive hemorrhage, anesthetic management has to be appropriate. Generally, whenever the patient has massive hemorrhage, we tend to cut off the inhalational agent and we give 100% oxygen, and there is a problem with awareness. So generally what we do in our hospital is we give ketamine, fentanyl, midazolam infusion. Generally, if you look at the incident, the dose of ketamine more than 1 milligram per kg can also cause myocardial depression. So we just give 0.5 milligrams loading dose followed by a infusion of ketamine, midazolam, and fentanyl. Generally, it prevents awareness effectively. In almost 100% of cases, we have not had awareness issue. And once the BP stabilizes, then you can restart inhalational agent. And as I said, antibiotic prophylaxis has to be repeated if the need arises. But again, when you have massive hemorrhage, be prepared for a major massive transfusion protocol. Be prepared. So the transfusion trigger should do not allow hemoglobin to fall less than 6 grams. Do not allow hemoglobin to, hematocrit to fall less than 15 milligram, 15%, and see that the coagulopathy is under control. So do not give excess crystalloid resuscitation beyond 2 to 3 liters, because it can cause dilutional coagulopathy. Hypothermia can cause coagulopathy. So prevent hypothermia, prevent dilutional coagulopathy. And generally, when you overzealous crystalloid resuscitation can also cause thrombocytopenia. And this is where we need to check intraoperative parameters to send the coagulation profile, or if you have thromboelastography, check that and see that you maintain decent hemostasis control. And you need to have a specific coordinator for assessment of blood loss and replacement of blood loss, because it's very important to assess the ongoing blood loss. Blood transfusion also should be judicious. More is not necessarily better, and too little, too late also is dangerous. So you need to strike the balance. I don't want that we have a bedside HemoQ monitoring, and I don't want this thing to happen that hemoglobin has fallen to 2.6 grams. As I said, the transfusion trigger should be 6 grams and above. And the CVP trace also indicates that it's a hypovolemic trace. So basically, this was a patient with unanticipated obstetric hemorrhage, and you see we don't have arterial line and extremes of blood pressure. NIBP may be a spurious thing. And even if you see the end-tidal carbon dioxide also has reduced from 35, that means it's a low cardiac output state. You have to be careful. It is always prudent. The best output cardiac output monitor is urine output of more than 0.5 ml per kg per hour, which has to be maintained. As I said, prevent the triad of acidemia, hypothermia, and coagulopathy. It is deadly triad, and you need to have a appropriate transfusion trigger. TEG is not there in most of the hospitals, but it's a very, very useful device. Generally, we do blood gases, monitoring of calcium, and like massive transfusion protocol has to be appropriately followed. So serial monitoring of CBC, peripheral smear, PTINR, APTT, platelet count are to be done to minimize or treat coagulopathy aggressively. Do not allow lactate to accumulate. Do not induce hypoglycemia because of massive citrate toxicity. And whenever you're giving stored blood, beware of potassium. Hyperkalemia, we have had 2 cases of hyperkalemic cardiac arrest. Both came out and both went home, but you have to be careful. Cell salvage is another useful device which can be used electively for adherent placenta or placenta previa. And we have no experience in this, but we use in liver transplant surgeries. But if you see, cell salvage is quite useful. Risk of amniotic fluid embolism with cell salvage is very, very rare. It's a theoretical risk. And if at all you have a Rh negative woman, see that you give you do a KB test, Clearhouse Betke test, and also you give recombinant, you give anti-D injection within 72 hours. The role of factor 7A in massive obstetric hemorrhage is on the vein. It's only anecdotal. We have not used almost last 1 decade, but earlier we have had 17 cases. But yes, it can be used when there is a need, but you need to have a corrected coagulopathy before you use recombinant factor 7A. Well, this is our comparative data where we have done peripartum hysterectomies. We have divided into 2 groups, one with internal iliac balloon occlusion balloon catheters and one without balloon catheters. And this was the data from single center, our own center, same team of surgeons, same team of anesthesiologists. If you see, group A was occlusion catheters, group B was group B was without occlusion catheter, yes. And if you see the blood loss, I think this is group A, yeah. Blood loss was more in without balloons when compared to with balloons. And importantly, the p-value on minimizing blood loss or minimal blood loss was significant in patients with balloon catheters. If you look at the mode of anesthesia, if you look at the mode of anesthesia was regional in occlusion group, whereas it was predominantly conversion to GA in non-balloon group. Again, significant p-value. Complication rate in terms of post-operative ICU ventilation, hospital stay were all high in patients who had no balloons versus patients where internal occlusion balloon catheter were placed. And neonatal outcomes was good in both the groups. There were no mortalities, there were no metal mortality. I must tell you that we have had to date 127 cases of peripartum hysterectomy. This is again 2017 data with a nil mortality. And I must tell you that Fernandez Hospital does not have a blood bank, and we have a massive transfusion protocol in place to minimize any eventuality. Placement of vascular clamp, we had 1 case, uneventful recovery. So of the cases, 127 cases, 77 cases we had put internal occlusion balloon catheters, and Fogarty extraction of thrombus was seen in 5 cases. Embolization was needed in 1, and massive transfusion was needed in only 7 cases. 5 cases we had to give methotrexate. Spontaneous expulsion was seen in 3. In pyometra, emergency hysterectomy was done in 2 patients. Well, the risk management strategies are very important, and we have to be prepared for all eventualities. So placement of central line, arterial line, different sizes, well-flown laboratory things, all have to be should be there in the theater. I'll just conclude with this slide. We are doing a workshop on morbidly adherent placenta, and this is a case of Perkita. And we had a very eminent obstetrician, Dr. Paili from Thrissur, Kerala, who was operating. And this was the case, as I said, invading the bladder, and you can see the tortuous, sinuous, adherent placenta, a very stable patient. We did a classical cesarean section, baby delivered. The moment baby delivered, patient crashed. And you can see the falling blood pressure. Patient lost almost about 12 liters in less than 8 minutes, 2 times the patient's blood volume. And I told surgeon to do something, otherwise we are going to lose her. Immediately, we had basically aortic clamp placed, and the patient recovered and completely, like basically, immediately we could regain the blood pressure. If you see post aortic clamp was placed and the blood pressure came up. If you see without aortic clamp, this is a patient was almost crashing, And the moment we place the cardiac clamp, at least the BP regained and subsequently patient recovered. So this is a case of massive transfusion. They lost almost about 12 liters in 8 minutes, which we don't see even in aortic surgeries. So practice points and conclusion is call for right help early, wide bore venous access, planned invasive arterial blood pressure monitoring, avoid NIBP, it may not be accurate, activation of massive transfusion protocol, judicious crystallite resuscitation, do not give overzealous fluids because it can cause dilutional coagulopathy. We don't give colloids at all in our center, and appropriate transfusion triggers to minimize, again, overzealous, extreme fall in hemoglobin. Keep the patient warm, multidisciplinary approach, do not delay hysterectomy. The decision to do hysterectomy should be early. Beware of stump bleeds. We generally don't do subtotal hysterectomy, we do total abdominal hysterectomy. Point of care testing like TEG is quite helpful, especially achieving macrovascular hemostasis, and tranexamic acid also helps in macrovascular hemostasis. Post-resuscitation ICU care, this is very, very important. And when the patient is in ICU, especially with TRALI, ARDS, or omental edema, sometimes we have seen abdominal compartment syndromes also. So they need the best of intensive care management. And if at all you don't have all these facilities, better to transfer the patient to a higher center after the damage control measures have been taken. So whenever you have a patient with morbidly adherent placenta, assessment of blood loss, of blood and blood components, quantifying replacement has to be a continuous process. It has to be a continuous process along with appropriate laboratory workup. So to conclude, each one of us has a responsibility towards patient safety, and no patient should die of massive hemorrhage. After 2017, as I said, on an average, we do almost about 25 to 30 cases of peripartum hysterectomy, almost about 80% are weak because of your abnormal placentation. And I'm proud to say that 0% mortality. 0% mortality just because of the protocolized approach. Thank you very much. This is just an announcement that we have a AOA webinar in the month of December. The title is Recent Advances in Obstetric Anesthesia. We also have paper presentation and best paper awards are also there. We request you to become member of AOA India. We at Fernandez Hospital and at AIG Hospital, Gachibowli, we have started postdoctoral fellowship courses in obstetric anesthesia and postdoctoral fellowship courses in perioperative medicine. This obstetric anesthesia fellowship course has been going on since 2007, but we are starting postdoctoral fellowship course in perioperative medicine from Jan 2021. Whoever is interested, they can mail me and we can give you more details. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and any questions, you can direct them to me. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Dear chairpersons, Dr. Madhusudan Upadhyay is there to answer the question. I don't find second speaker, Dr. Sunil Pandya. You can have one-on questions by both of you or any comments to Madhusudan Upadhyay, and then we will move to the inaugural ceremony. So you can put any questions or your comments on Madhusudan Upadhyay. Dr. Kanta Madam and Dr. Deshpande, please.
Good morning, everybody. Madam. Yes, madam. Yes, madam. Please.
Yes. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So there is no question in chat box.
There is no question.
Sir, Dr. Madhusudan, my best friend.
Yes, sir.
Very well narrated, sir. PDPS, no doubt about it. Best comments about Augustus Bayer, which I was also not knowing. Nice pathophysiology. Good comments on hydration and overhydration. And regional blocks, sometimes they help. Treatment, you said, most of the things are not available at the district levels or taluka levels. Nowadays, we are getting gabapentin also. We have to go on with the usual treatment, which we do it for the PDPH. And the best treatment is that assurance and faith of the patient in you. That matters a lot for the treatment of the PDPH. Thank you very much, sir. Very nice presentation, no doubt.
Thank you so much.
Sunil Pandey, sir, as usual, no doubt about it. And very nice preparation, very nicely done. Nicely done. But that abnormal placenta itself is a matter which has to be done in the institute and not in the nursing homes at all, for the betterment of the patient and not for your proud that you did it. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks to Dr. Giri, President-elect ISA, and thanks to President and Secretary of the ISA Kerala. And my last thanks to AR Logics, who did it very nicely. Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Dr. Sunil Pandya cover all the clinical aspects regarding the placenta accreta, and this is also helpful to us also, because we are not doing too much for saving this patient, and Dr. Sunil Pandya, a clinical aspect is very good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Venkatagiri, sir. Sir, because we are running too short, so if chairperson permit, then we can conclude this section.
Yeah, we can conclude the
We have
session.
to conclude, madam.
Yeah, we have to conclude, madam, because it is late.
Okay, sir.
Giri sir, please allow us to conclude.
Okay, Madhusudan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
If there are any questions in the chat box, please pass them on to me. I will
Please.
answer them.
Yes.
Any by that, I will talk to you afterwards.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
I will talk.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, Kanta madam. Thank you. Kanta madam, thank you.
Thank you,
Welcome.
sir.
Thank you.
തുടങ്ങാം ഇനാഗ്രേഷൻ തുടങ്ങാം അത് കഴിഞ്ഞു അല്ല എനിക്ക് കാണുന്നില്ല എന്റെ സ്പോൺസേഴ്സ് മാത്രം കാണുന്നു